my name's Annie Ansana. I am the Director of Literacy for Educator Preparation and Induction Programs. I started with the department in August, and I came from higher education prior to this for the last several years. In that role, I was an instructor of literacy and general methods courses for elementary candidates, and served as the assistant director of teacher education at University of Illinois. So when I was hired here with the department, a big part of my job is thinking about everything that we've been communicating regarding the state initiatives and thinking about it through a higher education lens. So today what we're going to do for the rest of the afternoon is to focus on our second priority, which is instructional shifts. And we've been hearing throughout the morning on how our teachers in the field have been engaging in various instructional shifts. And so our goal this afternoon is to start thinking about what do those instructional shifts begin to look like in educator preparation. So what we'll do is, as we're thinking about those instructional shifts, probably the most obvious one that we're contending with now is the shift to the new EPP literacy standards. So if you could show me on your hand your level of familiarity with the EPP literacy standards, closed fist meaning, you know, I've just not had a chance to see those. A 1 or 2 being I've had a chance to glance them over. A 3 being I've read them over several times, begun having some conversations, and a 4 or 5 being I'm very comfortable with these new literacy standards. A show of hands. Great, so there's a range as we expected. We saw similar results as we were talking with our East and West EPP faculty as well. And so one of the things that I thought would be helpful as we all have different levels of familiarity with the EPP literacy standards is to spend just a bit of time talking about those. So if you can look in your folder, what we've included in there is the set of standards that are applicable to the group that we have been focusing on for this convening, which is early elementary and special education. In the folder, you'll see Tennessee State Board of Education, and this is our Tennessee Educator Preparation Policy 5.504. And again, this is just a segment. This is pages 19 through 31, and it's targeted specifically at looking at those early elementary and special education policy and standards. So you'll learn, these will become your best friend in the next few months as you're thinking about implementation within your programs. And later tomorrow we'll talk about our timeline with the proposal and the timeline for that implementation beginning in the fall of 2018. So we'll have some conversations about that a little bit later. So as we're gaining familiarity with these standards, one of the things that I did when I first started this job, I had to get really familiar with those standards very quickly. And so as I looked over this document, I started to realize the format that they were in, and then I started thinking about the format or the ways to be thinking about these EPP standards as I was thinking about implementation, if I was to be creating or thinking about implementing them into a program. And so I think there's 3 sort of hints or bits of advice that I would give as you're getting more familiar with these standards. The first I'd like to talk about, and we've been hearing all morning, is is alignment to the Tennessee academic standards. And what I wanted to show, and I'll share a document that it is not ready for distribution, but it will be. And this is a resource that we're working towards that may be helpful as you're thinking about implementing these in here. So this is the same document that you have in front of you, and what's really helpful to know is we think about that Tennessee academic standards were a major part of the conversation as stakeholders were gathering and engaging in the creation of these standards. But one thing that's very helpful for me as I was really getting to know these standards is as you look through Standard 1, we know that these EPP literacy standards are organized in 5 large domains that are very intuitive to teacher preparation, right? So Standard 1 is all about content, right? Content that our educator candidates need to know themselves, and content, literacy content that they need to be helping our students engage with. So Standard 1, all about content. Standards 2, 3, 4, and 5 are about a literacy-rich environment, curriculum and instruction, assessment and evaluation, professional learning, and collaboration. So we want to spend just a moment on Standard 1, and you'll see it's broken down into 8 different indicators with sub-indicators, right? 1.1 through 1.8. And just to make this connection clear with the alignment of the Tennessee academic standards, you'll see, and this is not on your document, so I want to just show this to you for illustrative purposes, but what I've done is I've hyperlinked. They actually use the same language as the Tennessee academic standards throughout Standard 1. So what you'll notice here, scroll down, for example, 1.3, vocabulary, knowledge, and acquisition. Comprehend figurative language, word relationships, and nuances and word meanings, and employ them in writing. And so when we click here, this hyperlink will show you that direct alignment where that language came from, right? This is the direct alignment with the Tennessee academic standards. And so again, taking that information we learned from Tammy and Sandy earlier today, it'll show that vertical progression of the standards, which is not only helpful, I thought about for teacher educators as you're thinking about planning for your candidates, but also really important for the candidates themselves as they're thinking about learning to prepare for students in all grades, say for an elementary. If you're a program licensed K through 5, they can see what the expectation is for that standard all the way throughout. So I thought that was a helpful connection to make right there, and we'll make this document available for you all as well. I thought this was also a nice connection. You'll notice Standard 3.5 calls out specifically that educator candidates need to implement curriculum that is comprehensive within and across grades, ensuring vertical and horizontal alignment with expected literacy outcomes for students. So again, we can see the importance of that. And I just wanted to call that out. I know that was real helpful for me as I was navigating those standards. The second tip as you're gaining familiarity with these standards is, again, they're organized in these 5 major buckets or domains that, again, are very intuitive as you're thinking about preparing your candidates to be effective teachers of literacy. However, when you think about the format that they're in, that format doesn't lend itself well necessarily if you're thinking about implementation. And so one thing I would encourage for you to do as you're looking at these standards, for example, we wouldn't necessarily look at Standard 1.1 and directly put it in a course, right? It's not in a linear format in that regard. And so one thing that was really helpful as I was gaining familiarity was to literally take this document and cut every single standard apart. And I'm a very tactile learner as well. And I was able to rearrange them in ways that made sense as you're thinking about planning your lesson, your course sequences, prepping for individual courses. But what it did is it would give you an opportunity to do a real deep dive and say, what does a standard really mean, right? Where does it make sense to be placing in terms of that development for the candidate? Okay, so, and there's multiple ways to do this. As we've been engaging with the East and West folks, they've done this in multiple ways. They've been taking chart paper and writing down the indicators and rearranging them on Post-its within their charts, right? They've been taking documents electronically and rearranging it. So I think that folks are finding it really helpful to manipulate this document in order to make sense of that implementation of the standards within course sequences and individual courses. And the third point I wanted to raise here, and many of you are probably keen on this last tip here, but some of these standards have multiple expectations per standard. And what you're seeing is you may see language that says select and then implement, right? And so what's really important in that regard as you're thinking about your candidates, if there's a multi-layered standard, how are you going to think about candidate development, right? How are you going to think about if it says select first and then implement later? What's the expectation? What do I need to be teaching candidates to do in order to select? And then what do I need to be doing to help prepare candidates to then implement, right? And so these standards lend themselves well as you're thinking about implementing throughout multiple courses or building upon. Does that make sense? Yeah. As others have been getting real familiar with these EPP literacy standards, have there been any other tips or things that have been helpful as you've been thinking about these in relation to implementing within your programs?
We could take our courses and have a heading across tables or whatever, and then cut this document apart and decide which ones would align with which courses.
And I think essentially what that can do is help with like a gap analysis, right? And you can see these naturally fit in what we've already have designed. And wow, there's this whole section here that we really need to reconsider, or even think maybe beyond our specific literacy courses and seeing alignment beyond into maybe your assessment courses or courses that are maybe not literacy specific, but still have a place. Thank you.
You can also curriculum map all of the courses within your program, which would include your content courses or whatever, and where all these pieces fall, which is similar to what Mindy said, but taking it one step further.
Right. Thinking about the entire program as implementing those standards.
I just want to point out this is also a place to collaborate across with your liberal arts gen ed courses because the number of these things are being met within those courses that you could tweak then for your education students in those courses.
What a great opportunity to be engaging in that collaboration that's necessary in a lot of ways. Thank you.
We've actually done some of that in the purposefully saying that they could actually, the gen ed could actually point out, if you were a teacher, you could, like they're modeling and speaking of it as they're doing it. So, and they actually initiated the conversation, so.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what our afternoon is gonna look like here. What we'd like to do, and again, in the spirit of thinking about instructional shifts, the next activity we'll engage you in is we'll give you an example course sequence and an example course syllabi and give you a chance to look at just one example of the implementation of these EPP literacy standards in a way that where there'll be many examples of thinking about in the context of teaching literacy in Tennessee. Okay, so we're going to engage you here in a moment in doing some analysis of an example of a course syllabus and course sequence. And then what we really want to spend the bulk of the time this afternoon is I'm thinking back to that last question that Liz raised before lunch, and thinking about what potential changes, what strengths do you have in your program already? What potential changes are you considering in light of our multiple conversations this morning, and in light of teaching literacy in Tennessee, and really have a chance to start identifying what are those changes. And so we'll have substantial amount of work time this afternoon, and then that'll translate tomorrow into giving you even more opportunity to meet with your team to create actionable next steps. And what we'll also do, Amy will lay out our timeline in more specifics regarding that proposal, and creating those actionable next steps. We can keep that timeline in mind as we backwards map in that regard. Did you have a question or an addition?
I had two comments that I wanted to make. One is that I know that you all have constraints at your various institutions. I've had a chance to talk with some of you about that today. But I'd encourage you to start with that open mind that we talked about in terms of norms. And before you just identify a bunch of barriers that prevent you from being able to make the changes you would want to make, think more broadly. Say, what could we do? How would we design this, if we didn't have those constraints? And then go back. You'll have a chance to go back to your campuses and really engage with faculty. And we're more than happy to, have conversations with others on your campuses about how to do this work. And I think things like connecting with your Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and maybe that hasn't been something that you've had a lot of success with in the past, but doesn't mean that it's not a good moment in time to revisit that. The second thing I do want to point out, with Standard 1, we want to make something really, really clear. I want you to take a look under the Standard 1 content knowledge, the bold, and I just want to point out something to you here. It says, educator candidates understand and implement. Want to make sure that you understand that all of Standard 1 is about knowledge of these standards, as well as the skill to implement effectively in the classroom. And as the ed prep provider, when you are thinking about constructing your candidate assessment systems, you want to make sure that you're thinking not only about knowledge, which is really important, but also that you are assessing the candidate's ability to implement and use that knowledge effectively. So those are my 2 points.
So there's another document inside of your folder. It's a horizontal paper, and it begins course sequence at the top. And if you can pull that one out, what I'd like to do is help you get oriented with this document, and then we'll get busy doing some analysis. And I want to stress again that this is just an example. We know that there's a lot of good work and good thought about implementing these standards within your course programs again, and specifically thinking about doing so in relation to teaching literacy in Tennessee. And so what this example does is provides a few ways that teaching literacy in Tennessee can be thought through within course sequences and course planning, okay? So this is a 3-page document, and what you'll see on the first page is that this is an example of semester 1, 2, and 3 of integrated literacy for elementary teaching 1 in that first semester, integrated literacy for elementary teaching 2 in the second, and integrated literacy for elementary teaching 3 in that third semester. There's examples of clinical experiences that candidates may engage in while they'd be taking these courses. So this first page is just a look at an example course sequence. Of course, you are probably looking at this and saying, well, we don't have 3 courses. That's okay. This is just one way of looking at it, right? The second page, if you can flip it over to the back, is you'll see two tables. On the left side, this is sort of zooming in, narrowing in on the first course, Integrated Literacy 1, on the left-hand side in the table. And this is an example of a breakdown of what weekly topics might look like in that first course. On the second table, this is a weekly breakdown of topics for the second course. Again, if you flip to that third page, we narrow down a bit further, and what you'll see on that third page on the left-hand side with the table is an example of 2 weeks within that first course where you see both the topic and the readings that are assigned, the accompanying standards, and the field expectations for both the first course and the second course. So you can see how this goes from sequence to weekly topics and courses to more detail about those specific weeks. And again, this is just one example, right? So what I'd like for you to do for the next 4 minutes or so is independently look across these 3 pages and think about, how is this example syllabus reflective of teaching literacy in Tennessee? What are the strengths and what are the areas to improve? When you're ready, go ahead and turn and talk with your neighbor for the next few minutes. Talk about areas that you see that are a strong example of teaching literacy in Tennessee within the sequence and course, and areas that need improvement.
I want to make sure something's really clear. This is not an exemplar. It is an example. Yep. And so we are not saying to you that this is what you need to figure out how to, you don't need to do it just this way. I was just talking with some of my friends from MTSU saying, think about it as if there is an EPP, maybe all of a sudden there's a Southeast, Middle, West Tennessee College of Education, and they came to you and said, hey, we're putting together our literacy program, and this is where we are today. Where do you think we've hit the nail on the head? And what are we missing? So this is not intended for us to be handing you something and saying, this is the way we want you to do this. This is really a tool, an exercise for you to begin thinking about how you would organize against all of these literacy standards. Does that make sense? Thinking about everything we heard from Becky and Liz this morning about integration and all of that work. So we're trying to see some of that reflected here. Not sure we've completely achieved it, but we just wanted to give you an example. Okay.
What are some of those thoughts as you've been talking with your peers or your thought partners? What are areas of strength and what are areas that could still be improved upon as you're looking at these sequences and courses?
Well, I like the point that they start right away with deficit thinking. To get that out of the way, I mean, I think that's a real strength component of it.
Especially if we're thinking about candidate development, right? And you're thinking like, we want to hit that right away and starting to instill in our candidates that student differences are assets, right? We can use those to enhance our classroom. Thank you.
guess one of the things that I would, and maybe it's here and I just don't see it, is more of that integration of writing within this as it goes along, because it feels, reading, but not as much writing.
An area to improve, really hitting in that integration within the reading and speaking.
And obviously, we just have a snippet of this course information. We just have a small piece of this course sequence information, but I think a lot more time would need to be spent on foundations of literacy development. And of course, and it looks like there are assessments on those things throughout the course, but it doesn't say within the topics of the courses that they're going to be discussed. But again, we can infer that they are, but from this we can't see that. So I think more time would either need to be spent up front in the first 5 to 6 weeks, maybe, not 1 to 2, or making it clear how it was integrated throughout the semester.
I have 2 points on that, actually. You raised 2 very good points. The way that this example talks about the foundational knowledge, right, in regards to specific literacy skills, is shown on that second page as in-class assessments, right? And so again, reflecting on standard 1, which is all about content, the expectation is that the candidates themselves have deep knowledge, and then they're also able to work with students in that regard. So in what ways in our programs can we ensure that our candidates have that deep knowledge themselves, if that's what the expectation is? This is one method. It may not be the best method, right? But it's a consideration. The second point I wanted to mention that both you and Mark raised as well is this is just a syllabus is up for interpretation, right? However, it is the main source of communication we have with our candidates, right? So in a lot of regard, we have to be very mindful and aware of what we're putting in here and what are those expectations. However, there's still a lot of room for interpretation, just that challenge. Amy, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I love this conversation. I think it's bringing out a lot of thoughtfulness. And I guess I would just consider going back and asking to be thinking about if we teach those foundational skills at the beginning and we're not talking about how they're integrated from the beginning, are we possibly sending a message to our candidates? And I mean, yes, you have to practice some of those skills and direct instruction with some of those skills, but regardless, making sure that when your candidate leave the program, or probably even just the class, that they're thinking about that integration and why it's important, and thinking about that they know how to make that integration happen. Did you want to add something, Becky?
Yeah, just maybe another visual to this. I tend to be a visual learner, so I kind of think about, like this earlier, I talked about this being an interwoven tapestry. So it's almost like pulling out a thread and studying phonological awareness, the levels of phonological awareness, how to best support phonological awareness, and then how it is woven back together in that interwoven tapestry. How we pull out the thread of phonics and understand the phonics continuum and how to best instruct it, and then how we weave it back in together. So it's important that we might, that our pre-service candidates understand each of those threads, but then how to put them back together.
Other thoughts on this document? Strengths, areas for improvement?
So a lot of what you've talked about is integration, and that was one place we didn't see evident, and I think somebody brought that up. But I have to say, when I read the week 1, what would be happening in the classroom, I'm a math educator, sneaking in on the literacy world. This whole first thing is exactly what I do my first week in math education. So if that's happening in our math classes and in our social studies classes and our science classes, what a really good place to integrate it and have the assignment run across.
Great point, and especially as we're thinking about how these standards are, maybe even though they're EPP literacy standards, doesn't necessarily mean they need to stay just in our literacy courses, but thinking about our programs as a whole and how we piece that together and making those connections with the other courses. Thank you. Other thoughts? Right over here.
I don't see where children with a range of abilities are reflected in the, may be there, but I would like them to be more prominently.
An area of improvement there, talking about our students with varied needs and how we think about that as learning to teach, right?
In terms of their literacy.
In terms of basically the most important, I think, tenets of the teaching literacy document or later, unit design, text complexity, assessment, basic instruction.
You notice that those weekly topics are actually the language of the standards themselves, right? And before we click there, I just wanted to make a point here. This is yet another just example that is actually reflective of some of the courses that we're still seeing being taught, and a glance over of what these weekly topics could look like. Does this resonate with any of you? Have you seen this before, right? Now, this does not assume that there isn't integration, right? But we think a little bit about, this is essentially organized around the textbook, right? And you're thinking about it being one topic at a time that may lend itself to more of that isolated teaching that we're trying to move away from.
That's kind of where I was going to go, because when you're talking about those foundational skills, I see our candidates pretty much at the same level as the third grade students that they're going to be going out and teaching, in that when it's a new concept, they cannot have it just for 2 weeks. It has to be embedded, and we have to revisit it, and we have to have their attention and keep them revisiting and practicing over and over and over. That is not reflected here.
My comment was coming more from the world of special education, but so I've struggled with some of this today. It's great content, but we really prepare our teacher candidates to go out and do some of that skill, direct targeting specific skill instruction. So I don't see that as much here because it's more of a holistic approach, which is wonderful for an elementary setting. But for some of my teacher candidates, they need more, we're preparing them to work with kids to work on some of those isolated skills because they're not getting it in Tier 1. So that's just something that's missing here when I think more about Tier 2 and Tier 3, and that's a lot of my teacher candidates, that's what we're preparing them to do. So,
Are there any other thoughts about that from other SPED folks in the room? So I know this is something that we've heard not just here, but at our other convenings as well. You agree? Yep. We're going to switch gears a bit, and we're going to transition into smaller groups, taking the discussion that we've just had and thinking about, which you've already begun to do, your own programs, right? And what we want to do is give you an opportunity to meet in smaller groups. And what we've done is just randomly assigned you to a room to be able to have engagement with your own individual teams, and begin thinking about a series of questions that will help you. The spirit of this conversation should really be about change, right? We have identified some areas, it sounds like you've been talking about areas in your programs that are really strong as you're thinking about implementation of these standards, and you've also been identifying areas that may be potentially need of revision or rethinking. And so in your folder, there's a half sheet of paper, and it says Day 1 Instructional Shifts and Breakout Rooms. And what we'll do is we will, I encourage you to take this with you, and we'll break into these rooms here so you are all oriented. This is room 101, okay? Room 101A is where our breakfast was served, so that's just directly behind you. And room 200 is actually up the stairs and in that behind that door over there. A small note about room 200, we can't take any food or drink in there. So apologies for that. They have a lot of technology equipment they want to make sure stays intact. So what we'll do is we'll break into these individual rooms. We'll come back here so you can leave your stuff where it is. We encourage you to take that list of guiding questions with you, and we'll have department folks to help facilitate these conversations. But really the idea is thinking about change, right? And thinking about in examining your own course structures and syllabi, how do they get more complex and integrated over time? Are the EPP literacy standards adequately addressed? What changes might need to be made? And are there opportunities for literacy integration in content or pedagogy classes along the lines of the same conversations we've already started today?
And just as a quick reminder that our conversations today should be focused on early, elementary, and special populations programs. We are going to have additional opportunities to convene and talk about those secondary leader preparation programs. So I know those are on your mind, but if you'll try to stay focused today on the early, elementary, and special populations programs, that'd be great.